Thank you, everyone. This is my first time in Sitka and my first time at WhaleFest, but it's so awesome to see so many familiar faces and have such a warm welcome. So thank you for having me here. My talk is titled Through Many Lenses, Community-Based Science in Alaska. For those of you that don't know me, though, like was mentioned, I grew up in Southeast Minnesota. I spent a lot of time with my grandma learning about the world around me and was just always a very curious person to understand how things worked together. And so I went off to school and eventually made my way to Alaska studying biology and physiology. And I've been here ever since. I tell people that Fairbanks makes you feral and unfit to live anywhere else. And so I think I'm stuck there. About 2 years ago, I graduated from my PhD program and started working for the Wildlife Conservation Society. For those of you that don't know, we're a global organization based with the head office in New York, but we have a local office in Fairbanks, Alaska, covering the Arctic Beringia region. We work across the planet to collaborate with local and Indigenous people to understand conservation issues in the places that they live and work. We value the health of people, animals, plants, fungi, and ecosystems as being inseparable. And for some of you, this may sound familiar to the concept of One Health. And One Health is the recognition that the interdependence of human, animal, and environmental health is intertwined, connected, and is important for understanding the holistic view of health of our communities. My friend likes to say this is Indigenous health. This is not new. And this means that I work with a lot of Alaskan communities. I work as the One Health Research Coordinator for our regional office. The three communities that I primarily work with are Utqiagvik, Ketchikan, and Bethel. And each of these communities is found along the coast, but has unique cultures, ecosystems, and wildlife that are important for their lifeways. We work together to understand what are priorities and issues related to health and conservation and try to find collaborative solutions together. To give you a bit of a global context for where we are, it's not just a home to all these amazing people, it's home to many wildlife that travel the globe. And so this map just shows 6 unique flyways for migratory birds that all come to Alaska to nest and raise their young before returning across the globe. So there's always a question of why do we want to conserve wildlife? And if you've ever been to the villages, you know dumpster art is a big part of life out there. And this is one of my favorites. It says, save the whales, ... for dinner. So there are many reasons why we care about keeping wildlife around. Biodiversity is really important for the health of our ecosystems, but it's also important for many traditional and subsistence lifestyles where these wildlife are a major source of food. I have many friends that say 90% of their food comes from the land. And so if our wildlife is having health issues or concerns, it's really important to the communities to understand what impacts this has. The CDC recently announced that the One Health paradigm is foundational to understanding outbreaks in terms of pandemics, but data collected is often lacking in context or metadata. And so people who have lived in these places, stewarded these lands for generations, have knowledge that I will never catch up to. And so it's incredibly important to partner with communities to find solutions and understand what the priorities are. So, what are our priorities? There are so many things that we can do to address health in these communities. How do we narrow our focus? And that's really challenging. We were approached by the USDA to examine the effects of zoonotics. And so for those of you that aren't familiar, zoonoses are diseases that can make people and animals sick. You may be familiar with some of these: rabies, avian flu, COVID. These are all zoonoses. And so understanding the relationships between people and animals helps us to better understand how to care for our health directly through spillover or spillback events where the germs may be passed back and forth, but also the indirect effects of how this may affect our food systems, like food sovereignty and food security in these communities. So in 2023, a study was done in Ohio, and this is a bit of a complicated figure, but don't be scared, I'll walk you through it. All I really want you to pay attention to is this colored green over here. They measured in human wastewater COVID alpha variant, and then they also looked at it in white-tailed deer populations. They looked again at when the Delta wave spiked in people and in white-tailed deer, and they were noticing a trend that these infections were co-occurring. We don't know exactly What the mechanism is, though, we don't know if it's people petting deer or deer petting people. We just don't have that information. We just know it's happening at the same time. So the question became, what does this mean for Alaska? We have very unique wildlife. We have very unique relationships with those wildlife. And the answer was, we don't really know. And so we have to go out and find out. And so we knew that we wanted to look at humans, wildlife, and domestic animal health to better understand the relationships in terms of zoonotics. But where and how do we begin? And this is where I wanted to introduce two concepts that may or may not be familiar to you all. One is relational One Health, and two-eyed seeing. So we already talked about One Health being the interconnected health of animals, people, and the ecosystem. And that's depicted in this upper panel here, where we can see that humans and animals in the ecosystem are all connected to each other in terms of health. But this broadens our definition of what the environment is and how we see health. And so the environment can include things like culture, the physical environment, spiritual, political, community, economic, and all of these together can influence our priorities and our decision-making and our values. And so how do we integrate that into our systems of understanding health? We need to consider worldview when we do this. And so for those of you that aren't familiar with this term, worldview is a set of beliefs that helps us understand our reality. It helps us to perceive ourselves and the world around us. The Yupiaq worldview exists on a plane of existence where the human realm, the natural realm, and the spiritual realm are all connected to each other. And that forms our worldview. And I apologize for the small text. I took a picture in the Bethel Library the first time I went to visit there. But one of the things that I wanted to point out about the Yupiaq worldview down here is that the people of the communities took extensive precautions in their practices to ensure continued life of the creatures they depend upon. And so this is an integral part of the worldview of the Yupiaq people. And Inupiaq values can be formed based off of worldviews. And so we can see in the list of Inupiaq values that humor is very important, but also knowledge of language, sharing, spirituality, respect for nature, and the generations that have come before us and the knowledge that they hold. In other communities that I've partnered with, like the Tlingit Haida communities, a strong sense of kinship and knowing who you are and where you came from is important. As David mentioned, moieties like eagle and wolf clan are represented by the wildlife of the region. This identity to the land, to the wildlife, is inextricable from the people that have lived here for generations. And with that comes a deep knowledge of the ecosystems and wildlife that they have stewarded for lifetimes. And so working with these people, we need to understand how to bring different worldviews and knowledge systems together. So how do we do that? It's hard. That's why I'd like to introduce the concept of two-eyed seeing. It's a concept that was introduced by a Mi'kmaq elder. If we all cover one eye, we can look with our Western science eye. If we cover the other eye, we can look with our Indigenous or place-based knowledge eye. But when we look with the both of them together, we have a more holistic view of what is happening in the world around us and a more comprehensive understanding of the problems and solutions that we can come to together. Two-eyed seeing recognizes that these approaches, these ways of knowing, are distinct, valid, and can be found across cultures and represented in different ways. The Maori represent it through two canoes pulling a fishing net together. There's wampum bead belts representing two parallel streams, and then the mixing of fresh and ocean waters together. Again, recognizing that each of these are distinct and maintain their identity, but work together to accomplish a goal. So in a very specific example of Alaskan two-eyed seeing, we work together to identify different knowledge systems that are valued equally. They depend upon trusting relationships, and this is foundational to a co-designed process to produce knowledge together. And so on the figure on the right, when we are trying to produce knowledge together, we want to do this in a fashion that is based on equity, but it revisits these tenets of gathering information, information analysis, and communication and control of information that is based off of mutual respect and sovereignty with these communities. So as we continued to develop our approaches to developing a One Health monitoring network with our communities, we expanded on the things that we wanted to explore to better understand the human aspect. We proposed examining wastewater. We worked with hunters and trappers to examine harvested animals. We worked with shelters and dog sled teams to collect samples from domestic animals. We went door knocking and made new friends to set traps around houses for what we called peri-domestic and urban wildlife. And we worked with existing researchers to fill gaps where there were gaps and to support efforts that were already ongoing. But before all of this, we engaged with interviews and group discussions and met with people to better understand what is already being done, what is already known. And so our approach began with relationship building and trust building, data sovereignty agreements so that the communities have the rights to decide how data is collected and shared, and interviews and focus groups to gather place-based knowledge from local and Indigenous people that have been aware of the wildlife and human health concerns for their generations. And then hosting community meetings to just make sure that we're constantly engaging in this iterative process of collaboration. So we went out to Utqiagvik and Bethel and attended community meetings, and food was always central to these activities. And so in the center, I have a picture of elder dinner plate from my visit to Bethel for the first time attending the Chamai Dance Festival. We've got muktuk aguduk, seal oil, and fry bread. So good. I also spent a lot of one-on-one time with elders, understanding stories that they had shared and stories that had been shared with them. Spent a lot of time fishing. But through all of this, we gained a lot of valuable insight into what it takes to implement solutions like this and bringing together different viewpoints. And one of the most impactful stories a friend shared was their experience of existing in two worlds as an Indigenous harvester, also working in a wildlife management position. And I highlighted one of the quotes at the end here that says, "They don't trust numbers, people from the community. They want to trust the person that's talking. But out here, it's really hard to gain their trust, and it's super easy to lose it. And once it's gone, it's lost forever." So trust is an incredibly important part, and trust involves an element of risk. And so understanding how to build and develop and grow from that is a major component of our efforts at our office, and establishing and investing in long-term relationships is a priority to the way that we do our work. More technically, from these conversations, we learned who's talking to who and who's not talking to who, and where information can be siloed. And so we engaged with many sectors in each of our communities to better understand where communications are flowing to better bring together human, animal, and environmental health together. All of this together informed our biological approaches for One Health monitoring. As I mentioned earlier, we worked with human wastewater sampling, wildlife, domestic dogs, harvested samples, and small mammal trapping. For all of these, we had to go through appropriate permitting and permissions processes that we're legally bound to, including animal care and use committees, trapping permits with Fish and Game. But going a step further, we engaged with local and Indigenous communities to understand what are the ethics around interacting with these animals to make sure that we are conducting ourselves respectfully. So for wastewater, this is a graph that came from Bethel's Yukon-Kuskokwim Health Corporation. They have this publicly available to show on their website, and it's data collected from wastewater sampling for 4 respiratory viruses. On the bottom of the graph there are dates, and on the far y-axis is abundance. And each of the lines represents a different respiratory virus, and blue is COVID, orange is flu A. The solid lines are from this year, the dotted lines are from last year. And so we can see that there are different trends in prevalence of these. And who has been to Bethel in March? Have you been to Chamai Dance Festival? Everybody's hugging each other, you're up all night, you're all from over the state, and we see a spike of COVID right after Chamai when we're all hanging out together. And so we can start to make contextual clues and understandings of this, of people just being in the same place together. We know that there's probably going to be some colds and flus getting passed back and forth. But from this, we were able to develop relationships with the Alaska Department of Health. They recognize that they do not have the manpower to go out to communities and form these relationships and understand what are the hesitancies about sharing this kind of data. So they approached us, a wildlife conservation entity, to go out and do public health work with communities and establish local testing. And so they have kits that they work with the University of Alaska Anchorage and then Environmental Health Office to share with wastewater operators so that they can collect samples and send them to Anchorage for analysis. And so they have recognized that we have these strong relationships with our community partners and have asked us to help them. We also had a lot of other partnerships across the state with various entities, including the University of Alaska, the National Native American Fish and Wildlife Society, and a variety of shelters and animal control facilities across the state that worked really hard to bring together samples for us to analyze. I also worked with tribal authorities and subsistence resource committee members to develop harvester kits for local harvesters to take out and sample from wildlife themselves. If I had to go out and catch an otter and sample it, I'd have to get permits, a boat, I'd have to learn how to catch them, I'd have to try not to get bit, all kinds of things that are really complicated and a lot of effort and a lot of time. By working with local and Indigenous harvesters that are already going out and harvesting otter, know where to find them, know how to do it safely, and have a lot of generational and contextual knowledge that they can also apply and provide with those samples, it's a huge benefit. It's not just a moral or ethical benefit to working with these communities. It is better science that we were able to achieve. And so we were also able to address issues like, how do we capture location data? This is something that's very sensitive to all hunters, but especially Indigenous hunters. How do we gather that information in a way that is sensitive and respectful? So together we were able to design these kits that were deployed in communities for harvesters to collect two kinds of samples. We have swabs, just like a Q-tip, and that's used to collect oral or nasal swabs, just like a COVID test, and then rectal swabs as well. And those would allow us to look for viral DNA to see if the animal was actively infected or actively sick. And the filter paper here on the lower right allows us to collect blood samples. And that allows us to look for antibodies to see if the animal had been previously infected and had since recovered and developed immunity. So this gives us two time points of information to understand how resilient a population is. And each animal has unique physiology that may or be more or less susceptible to developing disease and recovering from disease. And so in the case of flu A, we learned that through studies in California, feline populations are particularly susceptible to high path avian influenza. And so each unique species has unique abilities to recover from these diseases. And so in the context of food sovereignty, understanding if a population is resilient against these diseases, getting negative results, not just positive results, is incredibly important in terms of protecting subsistence lifestyles. One other thing that was really fun to create with these was I worked with KIC's Our Way of Life Committee to include the Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian names of all of the animals that are anticipated to be harvested. And so we worked really hard to represent the local languages on these data collection efforts. Like I mentioned earlier, we did trapping for urban wildlife, and this was to capture those wildlife that are in not so wild spaces. The voles that your dog catches, the mice that your kids catch. And so that potential interface between wild and not so wild spaces. And in order to do this, again, we had to form relationships and friendships with our community partners. And this was really fun. My friend Tiffany's twin girls helped me find places to set traps in Barrow. And so they got to join in the joys of catching and the disappointment of empty traps with us. We also worked a lot with shelters and dog sled teams, like I mentioned earlier. On the far side is Jeslyn Elliott. She's of Bethel Friends of Canines and has been putting forth an extraordinary effort to move hundreds of dogs out of Kipnuk and Kwigillinock after Typhoon Halong. She's somebody that I've partnered with to collect dog samples from various village dogs to understand, again, what are those potential interfaces between wild and not so wild spaces. This is also a plug. I'm fostering 2 dogs from Kipnut right now. He's up for adoption. He's the best boy. If anyone's looking for a dog. From all these efforts together, we were able to achieve a sample total count of 1,001 samples after a year of sampling. This would be impossible without the contributions and collaborations from the community. On the left-hand side, I designate from where each of these samples they came. And so we had some samples that were archived that were from years before we started. We had samples that came from partnering with other research efforts, and those are the opportunistic samples. Domestic sampling led by the UAF veterinary medicine team, and then urban wildlife, which included those efforts to trap around communities. And so I have on the right-hand side various species that we collected from. And so these are samples, not individuals. And so some animals had more than one sample, whether it be an oral rectal swab and a blood sample. So as many as 3 samples from one particular animal. We continue to process these samples with our partners at the University of Alaska Anchorage to understand if we have positive or negative detections. But we work with our community partners to interpret these findings because an animal that was harvested has a very unique history compared to an animal where a sample was collected from a stranding or a die-off event. And so we want to interpret these findings together with our communities to, again, have a full, complete understanding of what these positive and negative results mean. From a biologist perspective, we get really excited about positives. We found something, we want to see it. From a food sovereignty perspective, negatives are really exciting. Our food source is safe, it's resilient, it's abundant. These are really good things to know. And so expanding on our ability to provide community-based testing in community is something that we're moving forwards towards now. Right now, we have to bring everything to a central lab space in Anchorage. That takes time. The turnaround of information in terms of food safety needs to be as immediate as possible. And so we work to continue to develop new technologies with the University of Kentucky to be able to do testing within a day of capturing these samples. And so we're really looking forward to expanding on that as we continue to work with our community partners. So I've mentioned before, we're continuing to analyze these samples. And so the ways that we share these findings is really important. We want to go beyond just the scientific publication in a journal that hardly anybody ever reads. And instead, we want to engage in opportunities where people that matter most, that are impacted the most, have the opportunity to hear about this information. So in September, I hosted an international One Health retreat in Fairbanks where I invited my community partners, collaborators from across the US, and we all got together to talk about the impacts of community, and community was the central focus of this retreat. Folks from the University of Kentucky, engineers, were very excited. They had never been to a retreat before where community was the central focus of the topic of conversation. They had been so ingrained in their engineering world of like getting the resistors to work properly. We also engage in other opportunities like podcasts and radio shows and oral explanations of stories. And then on the right-hand side, going to communities and going to where you where you got the information, bringing it back to those communities and not putting the burden on the communities to come to you, to come to scientific formats. And so this is a community meeting in Barrow. They host a Soup and Science event every month. And so it's an anticipated event from the community to get together and learn more about what's being done in their communities. We have been fortunate to be able to take these lessons from grassroots to global efforts. This is a picture of the WCS Indonesia team on the right. We went there in June. I actually flew from Utqiagvik back to Fairbanks. I was in Fairbanks a day, and then I flew to Indonesia back to back. It was a long journey. And for anyone that forgets how big Alaska is, I was on a 10-hour flight to Japan. We were 5 hours in and we were still flying over Alaska. And so we were able to share our lessons of working with communities and understanding that there's many ways of knowing, many ways of communicating, and they're very excited to implement this strategy of community-based participatory science with their harvesters in their communities in North Sulawesi National Forest. One thing that I really want to emphasize, though, is the importance of people being able to tell their own story. I work with a really inspiring person. His name is Lloyd Pickock Jr. He's born and raised in Barrow. He works for UIC Science as a project manager, but he has aspirations to become a filmmaker. And we were fortunate to be able to hire him on to help tell the story of this work. And at the retreat, Lloyd got up and spoke at our film festival and talked about how hunters are scientists and scientists are hunters. We're all trying to understand and find information together. And from his values that were instilled in him as a young Inupiaq hunter, he was taught that when we harvest our first animal, we share it all. And to him, photography and storytelling are like hunting. Our talents and gifts are meant to be shared. And so now I would like to share with you all a sizzler reel of the film that he's made so far. And so I think we are
My
ready.
name is Maya Hamsike.
I'm Alyssa Leary.
My name's Jesselyn Elliott.
My name is Lloyd Puckle Jr. We're here at my cabin today to film for a short film UIC Science is working on in collaboration with the Wildlife Conservation Society.
I'm a social scientist for the Wildlife Conservation Society's Arctic Beringia program.
I work with the Yukon Custom Film Health Corporation in Bethel, Alaska, where we are standing right now. And I'm the Environmental Health Services Manager.
We're an animal rescue, as well as we do spay-neuter clinics in Bethel, as well as out in the villages.
I wear a couple different hats. Today it's a Bass Pro hat. Every other day, first of all, I'm a hunter and a fisherman. Focus is this idea of One Health and how these different sectors of health are all interconnected and related in one way or another. You could call it a web, so I see it more as a kubra or a net.
There he is.
So Lloyd's working on wrapping that up so that he can submit it to the Real Wild Film Festival, hosted in New York by the Wildlife Conservation Society, hopefully at next year's film festival. But we plan to host it at our local showing this next summer, which we're hoping to actually host in Utqiagvik this year. We had it in Fairbanks last year. It's my goal to hopefully have it be a rotating host through each of our community partners, again, to reduce the burden of communities having to come to us, and instead we as scientists going to them and sharing back what we've learned.
My name is Maya Hamsike.
Pardon me. So to summarize, I'd like to talk about some of the opportunities and challenges of community-based science. And I mentioned earlier that this is not only a moral and ethical opportunity to undo past harms with communities through data sovereignty agreements and building trust, but it's better science in that we are bringing together multiple ways of knowing. It's a more holistic approach. And by working collaboratively and with community partners, we can increase the capacity within communities to complement generational and place-based knowledge. This requires a considerable investment of time that is not always aligned with funding opportunities. And so recognizing that success can be redefined as forming relationships and trust beyond certain deliverables that are typical of funding expectations is something that I work really hard to communicate back to our program officers. And so working with these people that are at higher levels that dictate these timelines and funding cycles to understand that the seasonal cycles of communities may not always fall in line with the funding cycles is a big part of what I do. But together we have the opportunity to develop long-term relationships that go beyond just a single study, a single paper, and instead invest in a long-term relationship that is oriented towards maintaining tradition and life ways of these people. And so I'd like to say thank you to all of our partners at UAF, UAA, the USDA, UIC Science, the North Slope Borough Wildlife Department, Ketchikan Indian Community, the Yukon-Kuskokwim Health Corporation, Wildlife Conservation Society, the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, and the Alaskan Division of Public Health. But maybe even more importantly is all the individuals that helped us accomplish this. I can't say thank you enough. For people that helped collect samples from wastewater and animals to making sure we had a ride from the airport. It would have been impossible without the community around us. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.